get so tied up. So we saw that utilitarianism tries to give us a way to figure out what we ought to do morally. And it does that by asking us to weigh the results of what we're planning to do. In other words, if we're weighing things, should I do A, should I do B, what's the moral thing, what's the morally best choice? It says, weigh the consequences, which is why it's called a consequentialist theory. And it says, come down on the side that has the best results. Now, we saw that the principle of utility generally wants us to make those moral choices that produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, those definitions, and there's one like it in your textbook, do not tell us what we're to count as morally good. And we saw that various philosophers have taken moral goodness to mean ethereal things, like Plato thought the morally good was to be found in a form that only reason can get at, and that's inaccessible to the senses because it's in another world. We saw Aristotle talked about happiness, eudaimonia. Yeah, could you stop talking in the back? I'm not interested in competing with you today. All right? And I told you, I get complaints from people sitting up front when people are talking in the back. You know? And it's my job to keep order in the classroom. Right? That's part of what I get paid the big bucks for. If you think any adjunct here gets paid the big bucks, you're living in La La Land. You'd be shocked to know how little we get paid for what we do. Anyway, but I never bring that up. But here's the thing. Well, you know, that's fine. If either way, I've solved the problem. I don't hear somebody talking in the back of the room. If she wants to do that, then fine. You know. So we saw that the early hedonists, the early utilitarians, tried to take an old Greek view, and Aristotle meant by eudaimonia a lot more complicated things than just the pleasures of sensation as happiness. But the old-timey hedonists were more about pleasure and happiness being one, pleasurable sensations. And they thought if David Hume is saying we can no longer reason about morality because we can't discern moral rightness of, you can set that there, thank you, moral rightness or wrongness in actions, that does not count as being present. But, you know, folks, let me pause this. So, but today, and maybe I'll finish this up Wednesday, depending on how far we get today, we saw then that the original utilitarians adopted this view of hedonism, but they gave it a universal twist. Pleasure that we're interested in promoting is not our own pleasure solely, but the pleasure or happiness of all those affected by our actions, if we're making a private moral decision, or of society as a whole. Now, we looked at an example of utilitarian reasoning. We saw that Bentham was a little too simplistic and maybe a little too optimistic in thinking that we could actually assign numerical values to pains and pleasures. And he used the hedon as a measure of pain and pleasure. Plus one hedon equals the unit of pleasure, minus one hedon equals the unit of pain. And he thought we could assign numbers by taking into account, as we said last time, factors like the duration of a pain or pleasure, its intensity, the certainty of experiencing it, whether or not a pain or pleasure is followed by a sensation of the same or opposite kind, things like this. At any rate,
Could you break that down? Like, for example, how would you break down pregnancy or a woman having given birth using that unit of pleasure and unit of pain?
Well, essentially, he would say, if you want to find out whether it's the good, I guess you'd balance out the pain of childbirth versus the positives of bringing a new life into the world and the happiness both the parents in that new life might have now that they have a child, So one of the problems we'll see with utilitarianism is because it focuses only on the consequences of what we do, and all those consequences are located in the future. What we have to do to make a present day decision about what's morally right or morally wrong is to try to project or imagine what the future consequences will be. In other words, on building the Bakun Dam, you're balancing out the negatives of the cost of the dam, the impacted native villagers, the impacted forests and the animals in the forest, against the positives of providing cheap and accessible electricity to maybe hundreds of thousands of people, and the additional pleasurable lifestyle they might have now that they can run modern conveniences, now that there can be factories where people can have jobs and have a higher standard of living. You're balancing these things out.
It's determined over time. It's determined over time.
Well, yes, over time, but to make your decision now, you have to project future consequences. We looked at this little example of utilitarian reasoning where an uncle tries to say what's the right thing to do. Saturday, take my nephew to the circus, or stay at home and read a book that I enjoy. And we saw that there are negatives, like if the uncle doesn't care for circuses and he's going to be bored, that might be minus 5 hedons. But if he gets pleasure seeing the nephew enjoy himself, then that might be plus 2 hedons of sympathetic pleasure. And if the nephew enjoys himself a lot, it's called plus 10. So here, totaling up things, you get plus 7 hedons for that option, versus staying home and reading the book. Lots of times adults' pains and pleasures aren't as intense as children. So let's say you only have 6 hedons worth of pleasure if you stay home and read the book. But if you know you're disappointing your nephew, you're going to empathize, have sympathetic pain with your nephew's disappointment. And if your nephew's really disappointed, then minus 8 hedons. And as I explained last time, I think here, in this example, you have a plus on one side, a minus on the other. Pretty easy to see what the moral thing to do is for the uncle, right? It's to take the nephew to the circus. But in real utilitarian reasoning, it might be a plus versus a plus. And you'd go with the bigger plus. Or it could be two minuses, as in the case of something like euthanasia. Utilitarians have defended euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide and argued for its legalization, arguing that it's better for somebody to have euthanasia as an option. Literally, that word means a good death. Opt to be euthanized, like you put your pet to sleep, than say enduring the pain and suffering of another 4 to 6 months of late stage cancer. So you could have two negatives, and they would say that euthanasia is less of a negative than the pain and suffering of a horrible terminal disease like that. So, well, we saw that because pains and pleasures. Oh, hold it. I'm going to get past this one because that one's. Because pains and pleasures aren't open to public inspection. And again, other units of measure that we use can be objectively confirmed by measuring things in the world, but pains and pleasures are subjective. That I'm standing up here now. I mean, I'm in some pain and I'm trying to be like a poker player and do my job, but they're subjective and they're not open to public inspection. Plus, think about it this way: how do you know how much of something you have? Whether you have 2 or 10 or 20 units of something, until you know what counts as having one of that thing. And the problem with something as elusive as a hedon, as a unit of pain or pleasure, is how can you get some kind of an objective way of specifying what's to count as one hedon's worth of pleasure?
What's the maximum hedon? That's what I was going to ask.
Well, there's no high end on it. You're comparing the hedons you think are produced by various actions. But the problem is, if you don't know what's to count as one hedon, how can you say how many you have? And so this has been a problem with hedonistic utilitarianism. Now, one of the things that I point out, and we're going there, but I usually jump there, is modern utilitarianism often combines the moral theory of utilitarianism, especially when you're talking about figuring out the rightness and wrongness of a public policy, the moral theory with a cost-benefit analysis. And so here, we know what counts as $1, even if we don't know what counts as one hedon. And it views the morally good as economic benefits of an action or a policy, and the morally bad as economic costs. So in other words, one way to look at the problem of building the Bakun Dam is hedonistically, right, where you're balancing out the additional pleasure you hope to bring to hundreds of thousands of people in society, Malaysian society, by building the dam and making more available, cheaper electricity there, having it there for them to raise their lifestyle, hopefully give them a happier life, and and as well as run machinery in factories, which takes a lot of electricity. You're balancing out those hedonistic goals of a happier society versus the negatives of the pain and suffering of the 10,000 displaced native villagers who are going to have to be relocated if you build the dam project. Project of the dam, not DAMN. And by the way, if you're writing on this, remember, a power dam is a 3-letter word. The other one is the 4-letter word. At any rate, so you can view it hedonistically, or you can say, well, what are the economic benefits versus the costs of building a hydroelectric dam? And, if this thing's going to produce relatively cheap power for the next 50 years, it's easy to argue that there are a lot of economic benefits to building it, and you weigh that against the economic costs and see which you have more of. So this way of looking at it weighs the good against the bad, but it takes and it recommends action on the side of the most benefits or the least costs for society as a whole.
An analogy of that be coming over here and colonizing and taking the Indians' land from the perspective of the Europeans?
Well, I don't know. I don't want to get into something that complicated.
Is that
Well, I don't know if it was utilitarian reasoning that lie behind that, but I think that there probably was similar reasoning involved there.
Deduction. They said, hey, we're going to take these Indians' land, but in the long run, we're going to benefit from it. Right?
Yeah, or that more people are going to. Now remember, the utilitarians are writing pretty much in the end of the 1700s through the 1900s. So a lot of those decisions that might have been made early on by settlers, then utilitarianism as a moral theory didn't even exist. Okay. One reply to the objection that we don't have countable units that we can specify is we do, in the real world, compare pains and pleasures, right? If somebody says my headache today is much worse than the one I had yesterday, they're not speaking gobbledygook. We understand what they mean. And I mentioned that hospitals have charts of 1 through 10, tell us what's your pain today. But even hospital workers recognize that all they're getting is not an exact numerical number that's intersubjectively verifiable, that more than one person can verify. All they're getting is a private subjective report of that patient's own assessment of where their pain is at for the day. And so even though we do make rough and ready comparisons between pains and pleasures, it doesn't imply that we can do it using the exact numerical figures that Bentham thought we could use. So, now, one of the things that Bentham says about pains and pleasures, and as I said, his original statement of the theory was simple. He thought the only thing we need to worry about is the quantity of pain or pleasure that we're talking about. And he said all pleasures are on a par if their quantity is the same, right? His famous quote, and I have part of it in an earlier slide, is that quantity of pleasure being the same, pushpin is as good as poetry. Now, pushpin, from what I've read, I think it's a British game. It's a simple child's game, something like pickup sticks. So you're saying, if you get as much pleasure and enjoyment out of pickup sticks as you do from reading, say, Maya Angelou's poetry, or Robert Frost, or going to a play or a concert, you're saying, well, it's all on a par. Now, this got Bentham into trouble with critics of utilitarianism because they said, look, here is a moral theory that is giving us a very low view of humans and human nature. It's basically seeing us as mere creatures of pain and pleasure, not much different from any other animal. And from what Bentham seemed to say, it seemed to, say, well, if the pig out there in the field gets as much enjoyment from its daily allotment of slop as you get from, reading poetry or going to a play or reading a novel or something, then all pleasures are on a par if their quantity is the same, and that's all we need to worry about. So by the time these sorts of criticisms were leveled at utilitarianism, Bentham was quite old. And so it was left to his star pupil, John Stuart Mill, to try to defend the theory against its critics. And Mill said, look, this is not really a theory that gives us a low view of human nature, because he says we need to distinguish pleasures qualitatively rather than just by mere quantity. And he says there are pleasures that you and I can experience that the pig out there in the field knows nothing of. One of the things that Mill said is, which one of us would trade places with the pig out there in a field for the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures? In other words, even if we were promised that we're going to be a very happy pig, and we have problems going on now, right? I have all these complications to deal with from the accident. You all have your own set of issues. We said, well, you can put that behind you. You're going to be a very happy pig in the field. Which one of us would take that deal? None of us would. Why? Because we know that as human beings, there are things that make life worthwhile for us that we can experience, that the pig out there in the field knows nothing of and never will know anything of. And so Mill said, we can, using utilitarianism, talk about a higher view of human nature by distinguishing pleasures by their quality. He says, there are pleasures involved with eating and drinking that he says those are lower pleasures. The pleasures, he says, of mere sensation. But he says there are other pleasures that are the pleasures of the intellect and the imagination. In other words, works of art like poetry and musical compositions, are made by using people's imaginations and their intellect. And he says those pleasures are higher pleasures, and they're more desirable even if they're lower in quantity. And not only would we not want to trade places with a pig in the field, but he says, look, it's better to be somebody like Socrates with all his problems, dissatisfied, but still having pleasures like the higher pleasure of being able to discuss philosophy with his friends and other people in the city. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool or a pig satisfied, says Mill. Now, this is a...
Okay. How don't we know that the pig wouldn't want to change places with us?
Well, good question. I think they assume that the pig wouldn't know enough to know what that would even mean, you know.
But we can't say for sure.
But you know, hedonistic utilitarians like Bentham, you know, said that non-human animals have a lot of rights by, you know, because they can suffer. He says the thing to ask about non-human animals is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? And if they can feel pain and pleasure, Bentham says they're entitled to rights as well. So utilitarians like Peter Singer, who we saw in the video, old-timey hedonistic utilitarians have also been animal rights activists. You know, Singer is an animal rights activist, right? And you can see that coming out in that extra credit video from Singer on what we eat, you know. So anyway, to move on, but yeah, I don't think he thinks that they could imagine the other side. Neither does he think that the pig in the field. He says if you want to know what pleasure is a higher pleasure, you don't ask the pig in the field, because the pig in the field knows only one side of the issue. Say whether the higher pleasure is reading poetry or listening to music or eating slop. Well, the pig in the field knows only one side of that.
That's an assumption.
You know.
But that's an
Well, again, you know,
poetry a different way than we.
Well, I mean, you know, you can argue that point if you want to. All I can say is that Mill would have thought that they can't really experience these things, you know. But I mean, we do know that you know, sometimes playing music will have an effect. Music soothes the savage beast, right? You know, I guess they never read that or something. At any rate, you know, to move on here, this is a subtle point, and I'm not going to bang it very hard, but remember, hedonism says it's only happiness or pleasure that are good in and of themselves. And Aristotle even told us, whatever you make the chief good, it has to be something that's good for its own sake, not just good because it promotes some other good. And the problem is, if Socrates is dissatisfied, but yet it's more desirable to be dissatisfied and have a lower quantity of pleasure with a higher quality of pleasure, like discussing philosophy, than it is to have other pleasures of sensation, then it says that whatever makes these higher pleasures valuable is not just pleasure alone. So the subtle point here is that means that Mill is sneaking in other standards of value besides just pleasure or happiness. And that undermines his hedonism, which says that only pleasure and happiness are good for themselves alone. Now, modern utilitarians have been like Jonathan Glover, who you saw in the video, who says, I find it hard to answer whether I'm a utilitarian. He says if you take utilitarianism to focus on hedonism, to say the only things that matter are pleasure in the absence of pain, he says, I'm not. But he says if you make consequentialism sufficiently pluralistic and still call it utilitarianism, Glover says, yeah, then I'm a utilitarian. Most utilitarians, contemporary ones, and Peter Singer is a notable exception, are what are called pluralists. In other words, they would agree, note I've got pleasure down here, they would agree with the hedonists that happiness or pleasure are good for their own sakes. But they also say that there are other psychological states, like knowledge as an unqualified good, self-realization, the satisfaction of human preferences. He says all of these can be goods as well. So they recognize other standards in addition to happiness or pleasure. And that's where most, so most utilitarians today overtly and knowingly abandon hedonism, but the old-timey utilitarians tried to stick by it. Now, we already made the points about that, but what are some of the advantages and disadvantages? Well, again, we said utilitarians were trying to respond to moral skepticism by getting moral reasoning down to earth, where we can empirically talk about things like the real pains and pleasures of real people in the real world. So they would say their theory removes morality from the realm of the transcendent and otherworldly. Now remember, they're writing in England, in a country that has the Church of England and Christianity as the state religion. So both Bentham and Mill try to say, we're not trying to be anti-religious, but we're trying to work out a way to talk about moral right and wrong that does not need to bring in any religious assumptions. And they thought they could respond to Hume's empirical criticisms of morality, where he says if you examine an action as closely as you want, like the action of murder, he says you'll never find that quality of moral vice in the action that makes us say it's morally wrong. Hume says the only thing you'll find are your own attitudes toward actions. Well, this is to say that we can't reason anymore objectively about moral right and wrong. And let me try to finish up some of these points. But I mean, if you have a quick question. But I mean, so you remember that Plato thought that the ultimate standard for moral goodness was an otherworldly standard, the form of the good in the intellectual world, known only by reason, not by the senses. Likewise, if in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you place a lot in the stress on following the commandments of a transcendent God, they're basically saying, look, we can talk about those might not be anything that we can get at empirically, but we can talk about the pains and pleasures of real people in the real world. So morality for them is just a matter of doing what on balance makes for the happiest society, or promotes more pleasure than pain for everyone affected by our actions in the world we actually live in. And we only have a minute or two, but another point is that it's disinterested. Now, the word is not uninterested, but disinterested. In other words, ideally, for utilitarian reasoning, we can stand back from a situation and ask, what really does promote the greatest good for the greatest number? And our own good, Bentham's quote is, in utilitarian reasoning, each is to count for one, but none for more than one. So we can take our own good as only one element in the mix. Philosophers call this type of objectivity taking the moral point of view. That is, standing back and making, from the situation, and making a moral decision as if it did not affect you. Just worry about what's the course of action that promotes the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay, we're going to look at some of the negatives later on, but that's okay.